Podcast with host Kevin Evans. To continue the conversation, head over to codetocloud.io.
Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of Code to Cloud. Today, I've got a bit of a, he's going to cringe when I say this, but a bit of a Terraform / internet celebrity, right? To talk all things Azure Terraform. He's like looking at me like, what are you doing, right? But folks have heard of Mark Tinerholt, right? The Azure Terraformer. You know, I remember, I think it was last year, me and Mark were in the Clone Wars, Tofu and Terraform at the time. We was coming backwards and forth, right, about the different versions and everything. Good conversation, but yeah. Mark, do you just want to introduce yourself very quickly?
My name is Mark Tinerholt. I'm principal architect at Microsoft Azure. I'm in engineering, so I actually don't do anything related to Terraform for my job other than use it occasionally when they let me. But yeah, I'm just really passionate about helping our customers use it. Prior to joining Microsoft, I discovered Terraform with that big bookstore in the cloud. So I brought that, over to Azure when I figured out Terraform could do Azure as well. And I was like, just never looked back. It's just been a fabulous way to automate all the things. So yeah, that's kind of where my where my interest comes from.
That's awesome. I had a similar thing. I worked for a partner and we did everything in code, right? So if you look at that persona of platform engineer, I'm not going to say DevOps engineer, I'll get loads of complaints, right? But that infrastructure developer persona, that's, they were using Bicep or they're using Terraform, right, to deploy their infrastructure, right, in their cloud. For me, I fell in love with Terraform because it was so logical. Once I'd got through the pain, because I think up to that point, I never wrote a line of code in my life, right, pretty much, except from simple bat scripts and PowerShell scripts back in the day. But it was my first entry into CI/CD, configuration management, right? Desired state, all of these words, right, in terms that sort of came along, right, when using Terraform. And I even had a buddy that I worked with, and he wrote like the registry version for AVD when that came out, right? Like he went through the whole incubation cycle, got it deployed to HashiCorp, right, to get validated and approved, and it ended up on the Terraform registry as a provider, right? It was crazy times, right? That was like, I'm gonna say, pandemic era kind of thing, just before the pandemic. People were starting to look at VDIs more and stuff, but yeah, it was okay. So you can not only consume it but contribute as well, right, to the community. But I think it's fair to say that you've built a bit of a online community, right? The Azure Terraformer, I kind of like that, right? It sounds like Transformers in disguise a little bit, but
yeah, it's kind of where the idea came from. It's like we're terraforming Azure, But yeah, I just felt like I don't know if it's the Microsoft heritage or the Windows heritage, but there's like a lot of ClickOps, or historically at least. I think things are getting rapidly better, but as people kind of reskill, but just wanted to open people's eyes to alternatives, to applying software development lifecycle and processes around their infrastructure development. I really like how you called it that, because it's there's a development process that you go through very similar to application development, but your end goal is not like a REST API. It's like a infrastructure platform or whatever, on the cloud of your choice, which my favorite, of course, and I think you agree, is Azure. So.
Of course, it is. It's the best flavor of ice cream, right? So, I agree, right? Like for me as well, especially when I started transitioning right over to Kubernetes,
Mhm.
the concepts were the same. Like obviously it's YAML controlled, right, and everything else. But again, the integration with Terraform and providers there was right. I got it because I learned the concepts using infrastructure as a code, right?
Mhm.
So I was able to configure then my orchestration platforms. Like so, it is a bit of a I remember the first time I wrote a piece of Terraform is a nice tidbit, right? The audience knows I like to give a bit of some tidbits, but I remember my boss and he sat me down, right? It wasn't sat me down, it was remote, but he was like, so I want you to learn this Terraform thing, right? And I was like, I don't even know where to start. And there wasn't much material online either about it.
Mm.
And I was like, right, okay. So I just remember writing 2,000 lines of code in a single manifest file, right? And I was like, whoa, I'm so impressed. I've never done anything like that. And I just remember showing it to my boss. And he was like, yeah, that's not a good look, my friend. There's no modules in there, right? Where's the provider? But he was surprised because he said, how are you deploying this?
Mm.
And I said, I use the Cloud Shell in the Azure portal because it's got Terraform built into it, right?
Mm.
And I was, again, looking back, you probably wouldn't do it this way, right? But it was me figuring out my way of doing it, right? Because there was no one to inspire me, right? Or show me what the right way of doing things was.
Yeah.
And
HashiCorp's definitely unopinionated historically.
yes,
So that cuts both ways, right? In many ways, it's like, yeah, we go figure it out, but and oftentimes, like for folks that are new to it, we've both been there. It's you find the ways of not doing it very quickly, and you're like, oh yeah, you probably shouldn't do that.
yeah, like I didn't even know what the Terraform Registry was at the time. For folks that listen to this that don't know what it is, but it's basically a public repo of sorts, public registry where you can go and get examples of what good looks like, or just to get you started, right? It's normally, I would say, 70 to 80% there, but then there's also, I mean, it's come on leaps and bounds, right? I would say, I'm like, even Microsoft has its own versions of this now, which we'll probably talk about a little bit later, right? We've got stuff on GitHub, right? Patterns, like, Azure verified modules, that kind of thing. But yeah, it was just trying to figure it all out. Like I come up with this analogy now when I'm introducing people to Terraform. It's just, or just start off with a resource group,
Yeah,
and a storage account,
yeah.
right? Don't go in there and deploy a landing zone, right? Or a server farm, right? Or whatever it may be. Just start small and build big, because
Yep.
those things, like, you should understand the concepts of them pretty well, right? They're very basic in nature, and it's a good way of breaking the ice when it comes to infrastructure as a code. Whereas I think at the time I was trying to deploy load balancer, 2 front-end servers, some SQL databases, right? And they've all got to speak to each other, right? They've all got to connect to each other. And
Yeah.
the load balancer has to be then associated with the servers that are behind it. And that's a separate piece of Terraform code, right? To write that. And then you have to learn how to do all these sequencing events and variables, right? I was like, people were like trying to teach me variable. It was like 6 months of, I'm not going to say pain, but like, to your point, Mark, Windows guys, especially ClickOps, right? We built servers in Hyper-V, VMware, and we spent a day with our coffee building that server, right? Literally, that's what we did, right?
Yeah.
And most of the time it was from memory, and it wasn't like a documentation sheet. And what you'd find is that your buddy next to you would probably build that server in a different way to the way you built it. even to like the server names, IP addresses, the patch version, whatever it may be, right? OS version, it was whatever you could get your hands on from an ISO kind of thing. So yeah. I mean, what was your first entry to Terraform? Can you remember when?
Well, I think I was doing a data center migration,
right,
on AWS actually, and we were working with OpsWorks, AWS OpsWorks, which is kind of this like service that AWS. I don't even know if it might have been retired on AWS, but it was basically like a Chef Zero, an implementation of Chef Zero.
right.
You would create Chef scripts and like you would provision stuff, and it was but it kind of had this kind of software development focus. Like, yeah, you're going to apply software development, but it was using Chef. And I was like, wow, I really like the idea of this, like the idea that it's not just like, us like trying to repeat the same, ClickOps steps to get this environment precisely the way we want it. But it just wasn't like all there. And then I started looking for alternatives. And of course I'd used ARM before, I'd used CloudFormation. But for whatever reason on one of those particular projects, like we were kind of mandated to use OpsWorks. But like this idea was of using an iterative kind of operational process around infrastructure as code, not just like shooting stuff up to the cloud, was kind of an eye-opening thing. And I started looking for maybe better alternatives. And that's ultimately how I found Terraform, because I think people were talking about, oh, well, Terraform, write once, run anywhere. Like it works on all the clouds, like that misnomer. Like it's obvious, it's not true. In that sense that like you can write once, run everywhere. It's the same language. It's but it's using a different provider. You're gonna ultimately have to write different code, different resources. But it can, do AWS. It can do Azure. So that was initially attractive to me, and then I started doing Terraform with AWS because like I saw that it could be cross cloud or cloud agnostic. And then after that, like very quickly, I moved over to doing Terraform with Azure, and the providers are not, at the time, this is many years ago, the providers are not created equally.
No, it was very one-sided, right, at the time. Yeah.
So but the Azure RM provider, the beloved Azure RM provider, has come a long way in the last 4 years or so, and probably longer than that. But there's still a long way to go. But we're light years ahead of where we were in those early days. But still, the power of and flexibility of being able to iterate, your Azure infrastructure, just like you said, lay down the tracks, create a resource group, add a storage account, add this, add that, let you build up iteratively to test things at those intermediate stages. And then just running that Terraform apply motion allows you just to have that much more like feeling of safety and reliability, that you can try something new, and if it doesn't work, like you didn't screw the pooch. Like it's not like resource group delete. It's just like comment out that resource, run apply again, get back to that safe place, and then try it again. And that kind of iterative motion, I found really, really attractive, and found a lot of benefit in that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. There's nothing better than seeing that Terraform apply complete.
Yeah.
As things become more complex, and as I say, Terraform trips over its own shoelaces sometimes, right, during the deployment process, right? And there's bits and pieces around that, but just watching, on the CLI, it being deployed is amazing. And it's such a good feeling. And then Terraform destroy, right? like the Terraform certification exam. It's been modernized recently. I think I need to retake it, but I forgot the entry one anyway. Like
The
I learned,
associated thing.
I learned a lot from that back in the day because it was
Mhm.
introducing cloud native approaches, right? Terminology that you would find, right? And desired state, configuration drift, all those good things, right? Like the things that you were looking at in terms of like you said, reliability in terms of deployments,
Yeah.
patterns and modules and all that good stuff. So and that's why I wanted to talk to you about Azure Terraform a little bit, because like you, I felt it was very one-sided in terms of providers and everything and tools, especially being developed out in the community and documentation. And then I don't know what happened, but a few years back, we sort of hit it hard, right? Like there was an internal team developed for it, right? Azure Terraform that would work with our Azure RM providers internally and our APIs. And they started bringing out tools such as Azure Terraform, but it's called Azure TF. Is it Exporter?
Azure Export Tool for Terraform.
Yeah, right.
That's what it's called.
Azure Terraform was an amazing name, by the way.
Sounds terrifying.
But when you're trying to search for it on your favorite search engine, maybe you need something that's a bit more obvious, right? But yeah, even that was like, and it was like, we've got an Azure Terraform team. It's like, yeah. And also for folks that are using Azure on the call, you can actually raise support tickets in the Azure portal for Terraform, right? For the as long as you're deploying it to Azure, obviously, right? But if you've got like a syntax issue or there's an error or there's something wrong with the provider, right, hitting back from the Azure RM, right, you can raise a ticket and it will go to the Azure Terraform team as well to be reviewed, right, internally. Now, that doesn't mean that the Azure Terraform team's a staff augmented dev shop in the background, right? But like, I was surprised when I found out about that, right? Like, I didn't even know we did that, right? So,
yeah.
But yeah, do you want to talk about what we've done, maybe internally, a little bit around that?
I mean that I know of that team. I'm they're colleagues of mine within the Azure core organization.
Same here.
But like, I'm not on that team, but like, I'm familiar with it. I don't speak officially for that team, but they're really nice guys and gals and stuff. They're part of the broader client tools group, which has all of our first party tools like Bicep, Azure CLI, PowerShell, all that. And I think Terraform is unique in the sense that it's the only third party tool that we dedicate full-time employees to. I think that's still true to this day. So yeah, we've definitely, as in terms of Microsoft, have been definitely making investments there, which is very refreshing. We have the AZ API provider, which I think we kind of led the way a little bit, because AWS, they just added a similar second provider called the Cloud CC provider, which architecturally is slightly different than the AZ API provider. But I joke with some of my AWS buddies, that, oh, you taking something out of the Azure playbook, huh? Okay, yeah. But yeah, the AZ API provider really helps from a day zero support standpoint. I think that's pretty much completely developed internally. The Azure RM provider we developed in partnership with HashiCorp.
Yeah.
So they're the primary maintainers, and we maintain it as well.
So just for folks that are listening in, what is the Azure API provider?
The AZ API provider?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a provider that basically, like, unlike the Azure RM provider, which has individual resource types for every Azure service and sub-resource under the sun, the AZ API provider takes like a different approach. It provides you with essentially like one resource to rule them all. So just like if you're familiar with ARM or Bicep, when you structure a resource block in ARM or Bicep, you specify a resource type and then a properties bag. And then that properties bag has schema that conforms with that resource type. The AZ API provider is essentially like doing the same thing. You specify that magic string, which is the resource type, and then you specify that body or the properties bag with the schema that matches ARM. And then AZ API just sends that up to the ARM control plane and processes it. So basically, there's no, unlike Azure RM, where they maintain an internal schema, which is nice in that it kind of smooths out some of the rough edges, so to speak, of like the canonical ARM schema for each resource. It allows some form of rationalization. The AZ API takes the official ARM schema and allows you to access any feature as soon as it's available within the ARM REST API. So that's basically gives you that day zero support for any new feature, any new service, any new resource. It's insanely useful. I don't think it supports all data plane like resources. I could be wrong about that, but I've just been working with like the Azure, some of the OpenAI services and the Azure Search Service, and I encountered some data plane like indexers and indices and stuff like that you provision to Azure Search that are not actually control plane resources. And like, I basically had to use, to create REST API calls up there with that. But maybe it's possible with the AZ API provider, because I thought it supported data plane resource. I'll have to look into that. But yeah.
If we got, we've got Azure Terraform. I think it's more of a holistic terminology, but I think I was either you or someone else, and we've got stuff at GitHub now, right? From a provider point of view as well, right?
What do you mean? Like
provisioning services in GitHub, right?
Oh, like GitHub resources?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Like we have way more providers than just for Azure at Microsoft. I've been trying to connect all those people together internally. Some of those providers, like the Azure AD provider, the Entra ID provider, that one I think is maintained by HashiCorp. But there's like a Fabric provider now, a Power Platform provider. There's a GitHub provider, Azure DevOps provider. So there's a lot of Microsoft control planes that you can automate using Terraform, which is pretty awesome. Yeah.
There's a lot of providers. I didn't know we had a Fabric one. That's good to know.
Yeah, that one is that one's pretty brand new. I think they just announced that like at some big conference in Sweden. I think Darius is the developer at Microsoft that developed that. Yeah.
So I'd like to get your take on this. But say if an organization is newly minted, right, and is looking at moving into infrastructure as a code, because I still speak to a lot of customers that haven't made that transition yet, right? What is your path of least resistance, right? When you're talking to customers or whoever it may be, and you're like, right, these are the 5 things, right, or whatever it is, 5 things to get you up and running, right, to reduce those. I was going to call them pain barriers. I don't know if that's the right terminology, but the adoption process, right? Because sometimes like it can be vertical for some organizations, right, or even folks. Have you got any insights or advice around that?
I think I've worked prior to Microsoft. I worked with a lot of customers, and tried to help them adopt infrastructure as code. And I think probably the biggest barrier is developing the muscle of applying software development lifecycle around infrastructure. That like you can do infrastructure as code, but unless you actually apply software development lifecycle around that infrastructure as code, the infrastructure essentially, what I see as very common is people will spend 3, 4, 6 weeks, 3 months, and they'll write a mountain of infrastructure as code. And this is not just a Terraform thing. ARM, Bicep, Terraform, Pulumi, whatever, right? They will write a mountain of infrastructure as code. They will shoot that environment up into the cloud, and then they will just ClickOps maintain it. And then all of that investment in the infrastructure as code gradually atrophies over time, right? Because people don't know, how to do a pull request process. It's cumbersome. They're not familiar with working in a source control environment. They don't know Git. They don't have that team ecosystem to actually, okay, we need to go update the code and then run a plan to see what's going to change and then run the apply, right? So not having that kind of methodology in place, or even some of the prerequisites for that methodology, which are basic skills like Git, and then like Git flow process, which is more like a soft skills aspect of software development. It's not really, technical. It's just like, this is how we do work. I think that will help people focus on the day 2 operations of infrastructure as code, as opposed to just like this very short term like payoff, which is like, I feel good. Like, oh, I saw Terraform apply complete. Yay. Like my whole environment's out there. But like now that code is going to go collect dust somewhere, and like, it's not even usable 3 months from now. Right. So I think there is some like, it's hard. It's hard to take that long view of infrastructure as code, like organizational development, versus those short-term, like just cloud shotgun, approach of just like getting the day 1 up. So I think organizations that are most successful with infrastructure as code are taking that longer view of like, how do we get day 2 ops smooth, so that we can actually maintain this long term. I think that's the most important thing for me.
I agree. I was getting flashbacks when you were going through all of that. I remember the first time I learned Git source control. My advice would be, if you've got an internal dev team, roll up to their desk, right? And they'll be like, why is the infrastructure team here, right? Why is the platform team here, right? And go, so source control, talk to me, right? And watch their face just, hit the floor kind of thing, right? And that's how DevOps was born, right? So it literally, try and utilize the developers that you may have access to, because they've had to go through all that process. Yeah, they're writing applications, or they're data configurations or data development or whatever it may be, but they're still using those same practices, right? To, again, pull requests, like peer reviews, writing up your comments, all that good stuff. I would say now that GitHub Copilot, I wish that would have been around when I was first starting to do this. And there's a free tier of that, by the way, not just to push our stuff constantly, but yeah, I can't live without it now. I've become so dependent on it. It's unbelievable. But write the comments for these code, right? So you can come back to it. Like you said, the day 2 operations, even if you do everything in code, if you come back to that code 6 months later, then you've got to try and remember why you did it that way, right? So try and use some of the automation tools around that to help you. But setting up a pipeline, you normally start off with the CLI, right? You get the Terraform binary, get it installed, fire up VS Code, pick your favorite Terraform extension. I know we've got one. There's one from HashiCorp as well, right?
That's the one I use. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one I use as well, right?
Yeah.
But you know, for syntax validation, that kind of thing. But yeah, but
Hi, listeners. Thank you for tuning in and being part of the Code to Cloud community. Your support and enthusiasm fuel our mission to bring you the best insights and conversations around cloud-native technologies. If you've enjoyed the podcast and would like to help us keep it going, you can support us through Patreon. Every contribution, big or small, helps us cover production costs and continue delivering valuable content to our listeners. We're incredibly grateful for your support, whether it's through Patreon, sharing the podcast with your network, or just being a loyal listener.
I just wanted to. I've had Matt and Jack. Do you know those guys?
Matt FFFFF.
Yes.
Of course, yeah. Matt and Jack. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. He's a buddy of mine, right, from the UK, obviously, and they've done Azure verified modules, right, which are like best practice, or they would say better practices. I can hear them now in the back of my head, right, in the terminology that I'm using. But better practices in terms of what does a good Terraform module look like for an Azure deployment, right? Be that AKS or whatever it may be, right? A VNet and everything else. So this is the same team that did Azure Landing Zones, which is our framework, right? It used to be called scaffolding back in the day, I believe, right? Like when it was first initiated, or enterprise scale, right? Those come of the words. But that is probably one of our biggest modules that we've like written and is freely available, right, on GitHub for organizations to use to deploy, you know, enterprise landing zones for what a good Azure environment looks like, right? Lots of moving parts there. Yeah. But what would you say about Azure verified modules for people starting out? I think they're a good place to start, but are you recommending those to customers? And
I think for organizations that have that level of maturity, I think that's a great place to start rolling out your platform, like the platforms that you want to host workloads. And I love how we are finally codifying these like standard practices, the best practices, rather than just like putting documentation out there, human language documentation. Like we can codify it in a language that people can then go easily reproduce that pattern. So I think that should be like the definition of done for all of our documentation, frankly. That like just to make it more expedient for our customers to go like roll out that stuff. But I think the AVM modules, it's actually like a module library, right? So there's many modules. Some are more are larger than others, and some have a focus more on kind of like the platform team versus like the application team. So I think it depends on where you sit within the organization, like what outcomes you're trying to accomplish with infrastructure as code. So I think many of the initial AVM modules, I could be wrong, but they seem to be focused on the platform side of the house, like in terms of laying down networks and, shared infrastructure and stuff like that. So I think if you're in that platform engineering space, those are great places to look. I also I love getting to the original sources as well, just from a learning standpoint. So I think knowing how the building blocks work is critical. And then when you go look at the guts like of an AVM module, then you're like, oh, I see what they're doing with these building blocks. And now I understand better what this AVM module is doing for me. Therefore, I can have a better chance of maintaining that whatever that environment is that I'm provisioning with via that AVM module longer term, right? So I definitely think there's a place for those patterns, to kind of be stamped out with modules. And that's what the AVM module initiative, or the AVM Azure Verified Module Initiative, is all about. And I think that's awesome in terms of helping improve the hygiene of Azure deployments across 3P customers. But I think part of, in order to be good stewards, like those are like high powered, weaponry, right? Like you need to earn that power, so to speak, in terms of like understanding like the building blocks that they're doing, that they're using. So I would just say you use the AVM, but make sure you do the work so that you understand like what the AVMs are abstracting from you. Does that make sense?
Makes complete sense. And I'm just going to give people a bit of a use case that I use Terraform a lot for, right? So as Mark will attest to, we have to turn up and look like the experts. A lot, right? It's our jobs, right, Mark? So, and the learning process around that, and everyone's different, right? Like, so you normally be given a topic or whatever it may be, right, to do with a project. And if you haven't done it before, then you sort of go into this phase of, right, I'm going to reverse engineer and learn this service, right? So I can talk about it in depth. So what I do is either deploy it in the portal first, ClickOps.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. It's a great discovery mechanism.
It's great discovery. Then say if I'm given like a customer scenario and they're like, well, we're trying to add this feature, but we've already deployed it and we can't seem to find it in the portal. I will then write the Terraform code for it. And then I will go through all the variable options of the Terraform registry to understand the service more, because it's really good at breaking it down. So once you've gone through the code at the bottom, there should be the variables and the options, and it actually explains what feature does, right? Which I absolutely love that. And then what I'll do is I'll deploy what's, say if it's a customer asking about a feature or a configuration they're trying to do and they can't implement it, I deploy it like the way the customer's got it first. Then I try and go make the change in Terraform. And I've had it where it's gone, this will destroy the resource, right? And then I realized that you probably had to make that configuration change on day 0 when you were deploying it, right? You had to bed it in, because sometimes you just can't retro change, right? Some of the deployments. But I probably would have been chasing my tail for 2 weeks trying to find that answer, but because I did it in Terraform, it told me what the before and after was going to be and the changes that were going to take place. I find that a really effective method. Don't get me wrong, it's not for everybody, but for me, it makes me understand the service a little bit more, because I'm gonna date myself here a little bit, Mark, but back in the day when we were back in the day when we had analog watches, we used to use something called switches on the CLI, right? / whatever it was. And that's how you sort of understood that part of the operating system, or that part of whatever it is, the program you were trying to launch. And I just think with Terraform, it does that as well, right? Like you can figure out those different parts of Azure, right? And understand how it works from a service point of view anyway, whatever it may be.
Yeah, totally. I think I use a similar technique often, like portal discovery, like maybe provision like if you're trying to figure out a specific use case that a customer needs or you need, I don't work with customers, but like if you're trying to figure out that specific use case, it's like, okay, well, I know how to provision vanilla, right? So I'll create a resource block that's like the most vanilla thing, get it out there. Okay. Now it's out in the portal. I'm going to go look in the portal. I'm going to be like, I'm going to bounce around in there. I'm going to try and figure out how to configure it the way that I want it configured in the portal. Once like I've got it working, then it's like I drop back to my Terraform code, run a plan. And if it's under Terraform management, it's not always the case, but if it is, Terraform plan is going to be like, I detected drift. and this is like one of those rare cases where the drift is intentional, right? Like I'm trying to elicit the drift because like the initial desired state I define in code is not actually where I want to get to. It's just like the starting point. I go and ClickOps out in the portal to get me to the desired state, and then I back into it in code, right? That's probably similar to like what you just described with your customer story. But it's definitely like a superpower of Terraform plan to be able to kind of back into those changes that you made. So sometimes drift is okay.
Yeah. It's like it's great for reverse engineering, right? Mm. A process or a deployment or configuration, right? So, okay. Now I know we're nearly at time, so what I'm gonna ask you, Mark, is top 3 skills, or top 3 approaches. If I was new to Terraform this year, right? Maybe I'm just getting into it. What top 3 skills would you say to people? Go out and learn these to get started with Terraform.
Well, I talk a lot about this, and I think it comes through in like the book that I authored, Mastering Terraform, as well as the Udemy course. The first thing you got to learn before you do Terraform. Oh, there, yeah. Oh, wow, look at that. Yeah, nice. The first thing you got to learn is you got to learn the cloud that you're targeting, right? You like Terraform really doesn't do anything, by itself. It's the providers and what the providers bring. And in order to use those providers, like the Azure RM provider, you really have to understand the Azure services that you want to go deploy. So that's probably the most important thing, right? Otherwise, like just learning Terraform, it's like learning HCL or something. Like, what are you going to go do? Create a bunch of random strings? So that would be the first thing. And then I think after you know the cloud platform and you don't have to know the whole cloud platform, right? Like to your point, like pick something small, a use case small, like I want to get a storage account going, or I want to get a web app, or a function app deployed or something like that. Learn those services, and then you'll be able to, embark on that Terraform journey. There's some prerequisite skills. I think, you should know Git. You should know Bash, to a certain extent. Like your Bash foo is probably way better than my Bash foo. But I think having a healthy dose of Bash scripting experience is very, very useful. Because you're going to interact with the Terraform CLI in Bash in many ways. So being able to extract outputs and things like that, and pass environment variables and stuff like that, it's just some basic skills in Bash is extremely important. And then I'd say the next step is, get a handle for the basics of the core workflow, plan, apply, destroy, and get some basic understanding of a HashiCorp configuration language, and go nuts, go build something. That's what my 7-day roadmap would be for somebody. Terraform is, in my opinion, it's ridiculously easy. Like it's not that complex. It's really just like the complexity comes from the more sophisticated the solutions that you want to go build with it, that's where the complexity comes in. But for somebody that's just getting started, it's very, very, very easy to get started, in my opinion.
That's awesome. No, I love that approach. Learn by doing.
Absolutely.
But to your point, Mark, pick a cloud, because otherwise you just get proficient with the cloud, right? And it's normally the cloud that's going to be paying for your role, right? Your job, right? Whatever it is you do, right? Double down on that first, right?
Yeah.
And then expand.
Yeah.
So awesome. So I've got some quick fire round questions. They're pretty fun, Mark. I've asked our technical guests, right, on the show, right?
Brain busters for me, huh?
I know, right? So they'll either resonate or they won't resonate. Last time I was pretty lucky with the last guest I asked this, right? But yeah, anyway. So the first one is favorite operating system ever.
Ever?
In the past.
Oh.
Or it could be anything. It could be your childhood OS. It could be whatever.
I don't, this is probably going to be the first that you've heard this. Have you ever heard of B operating system? BOS?
No, Mark, I haven't. No.
BOS is definitely my favorite operating system ever. If you like, that last word is very important. But it was an operating system that was, I think, a bunch of Apple guys left Apple and they started a company called BOS, and it originally ran on the Amiga.
I had one of those, the Amiga 500. I had one of those back in the day. Yeah.
And they ported it to PowerPC, and then it was like an alternative operating system for Mac. Like, this is way back, like Jobs had left Apple. So this was, I think,
the dark ages, the dark period, right?
The dark era of Mac. And then they ported it to x86, which is when I got involved. Because you could run it basically like on IBM PC hardware, and it was incredible, just absolutely incredible. Fast little operating system, super efficient. But unfortunately, they got bought by Palm, and after Steve Jobs returned to Apple, he brought Next.
That's right.
And the hopes and dreams of becoming the future, base of Mac OS X were dashed because Next, like OS, became what is today known as Mac OS rather than BOS. So, yeah. And basically, I don't even know if BOS is around anymore, but yeah, it was fun. It was a good, fun time while it lasted. Sorry, that was probably longer than you.
Absolutely loved it, Mark. That's a curveball right there. I've never heard of it. I'm going to get straight on Wikipedia, right, to try and find the archives on this.
You might be able to run it. I think it's called like Haiku or something